Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to my channel. Tonight we have a delightful little tag here from Shelley Swearingen. It is it started off as kind of a non-tag, but it's definitely qualifies as a tag and has become a tag. And I've been tagged by several people, I believe Michael Cavan among them, to do this. And I was planning to anyway when I first saw Shelley make this, and unfortunately I just haven't gotten to videos as quickly as I wanted to. I think March of the Poems had a little bit to do with that. But anyway, let's just dive right in. Question one: do you have books around? Or do you think of yourself as having a personal library? So, in other words, a differentiation. Is it just you have books to have books? Or are you cultivating a library for yourself? And there was a point in time where it was more in the first camp, um, where I would just pick up books to pick up books. Oh, that looks like a cool cover, cool title. Sounds like something that I might read someday, with no real thought other than the impulse buy. Hey, it's $1 paperback. You know, it sounds like something I would enjoy if I ever get around to reading it. And that path can lead to quickly overwhelming your shelves. Since then, I have had my collection ebb and flow several times, and it is building back up in a wonderful way. And I definitely feel that I have a personal library. And a healthy part of most libraries is an active culling of things that aren't going to be revisited, that aren't getting checked out as often if it's a normal library, things that just stagnate on the shelf. And every book that I read, I treat with that same kind of mentality of, is this something that I will want to revisit at some point in time? Am I wanting to hold on to this just for sentimental reasons, or just because, well, it's a well-known classic, so I should have it? And letting go of that mentality and thinking more critically about, is this something that I will reread someday? I am a big rereader, so there's a very high likelihood that I will reread things. So let's go to the next question here. Roll into, what does a collection or personal library mean to you? And it's a really interesting question to consider, because there is a difference between the two of those. A collection is, you're getting them because you are a collector. This is something that you have, you possess, you like to show it off. Sometimes you like to look at it, maybe interact with it in some way, shape, or form. Um, and that is its function, is to have it as something that you possess. With books, it's harder to walk that line, but you've got all kinds of knickknacks and other things that you see people collect and never open up, because that would diminish its value. And the joy comes from having this these things that are worth something to somebody else, maybe someday. And they're worth something to me because I enjoy them. Whereas a personal library gives the distinct impression of being something that is being used. It's active, it's living. It's somewhere where you turn to pull from. Um, I'm all for supporting local libraries, for checking out books from local libraries. Um, but I want my library to get to a point where I don't need to depend on them for much, because that's the point of my personal library. Is it's something that I want to have on hand to pull off, to read, to refer to revisit, whatever the case may be. What is your personal library for? depends on what part of the shelves you're looking at. There's heavy fiction sections that we've gone through in the book tours, where those are mostly for enjoyment, for exploring different authors, different stories, different worlds, and experiencing what that author has to share about those. Whereas we're getting into the parts, well, we visited the ancient and medieval literature and history. We're getting into poetry and biographies, and next week we'll have more reference oriented books that we'll be visiting, and those are more for that reference piece of it, the something that I'm probably not going to read this cover to cover every time or more than once, but it might be something that I pull back out and look back at multiple times over the course of and engaging with things. And a great example of that, just to grab one as a example here, is something like this companion to the Gawain poet. As interesting as the stuff is in here, it's going to have a whole bunch of essays pertaining to Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Pearl, patience, cleanliness, the different poetry by this poet and about this poet and all of that stuff. But it's not something that I'm going to want to read cover to cover multiple times, most likely. It'll mostly be for, I'm going to read this, and then anytime I'm revisiting the Sir Gawain and the Green Knight or something else by this poet, I might pull this out to revisit something that pertains to it, or if I'm teaching about it, it'll be something that I can pull out and kind of incorporate into what I'm teaching about and draw upon for inspiration for. So there's multiple facets for my personal library that maybe don't pertain to everybody. Next question is, where is your personal library? Is it contained to a single room or spread all about the house? It exists 100% down here, with the exception of my active reading shelf. I have a shelf on a bookshelf upstairs in our living room, and that shelf is about half to 2/3 of the way full at any given time with the books that I'm currently reading through. So I can just pull off whatever my mood is striking me at the moment and read from it. Some nights, like tonight, I might read from 2 or 3 of them in a single evening, whereas other times I'll just pull one and that'll be all I read in that sitting, and that's okay. But those books have homes down here, and they will come back down here once they're finished, and then a new one will cycle up to replace them. So it is contained to this room here, but some of them do live elsewhere temporarily. Next question, how many books make up your personal library? I don't know the answer to that. I would guess 500-ish at this point in time. It's constantly growing, but I am actively culling too as I read through things. As I said, if it's something that I'm not likely to revisit at any point in time in the future, for whatever reason, it goes. I have no qualms about parting with the books that aren't going to cut it for me. That's why something like recent read back in February, Steinbeck, The Acts of King Arthur and His Noble Knights. I'm glad I read it, but I don't feel any need to keep it because I have other versions of those same tales that Steinbeck did in there that I prefer to read over that. And so I'll probably never ever grab that again. How do you organize your personal library? I've always been interested in organizing at least my nonfiction stuff like a actual library would, but I have no idea how to categorize things through that Dewey Decimal System. It seems like it would be an interesting way to do that. However, it would only be a couple of different categories, I think, into which things would fall. So right now I mostly have it by genre first, and then by kind of period. groupings until I hit a point where it's like, well, this is so eclectic from this point on that I'm only able to make kind of sweeping generalizations on how things are grouped here. Um, so it's, and then within each of those categories, they're alphabetized in the genre fiction. And then once I get into the other stuff, it's not nearly as organized about that. I really need to sit down and spend an entire afternoon and just redo the system. And I'll probably do that once I get through my library tour, because I've got a small stack of them over here on my desk right now, that are building up on the new acquisitions that have come in since I started that tour, which is not very many yet, but I anticipate that to grow at least a little bit more in the next couple of weeks. How do you keep track of your personal library? If so, how? No, I've dabbled with wanting to try to keep tabs on it in Goodreads, and never. I've never fallen in love with Goodreads. I found that far too often I would mark when I started the book and then remember a week or two after finishing the book to go back and mark it as finished. And so, um, in theory, Goodreads is a great system. And since I'm no longer nearly as concerned about giving star ratings to the books I'm reading, the only exceptions are for smaller books, smaller authors. I want to support them, so I will give them a rating, a fair and honest rating, not just an inflated rating. But by and large, I that didn't really work out for me. I tried manually writing them down for a brief amount of time. Got to about 120 of the books into a journal at some point in time last year, and then realized that this is just not gonna work well. Um, I'm thinking about maybe downloading something like Library Thing and trying to hit 5 or 6 books a day, scanning into a collection there and trying to get caught up with it and keep up with it. And the reason for that is solely because if I'm out looking around and shopping and saying, do I have this book? And if I don't remember for sure offhand, I can pull it up and verify one way or the other. A good case in point would be something like Isaac Asimov. I know I've got a handful of them. I couldn't tell you what they are apart from those first 3 foundation books. And I know I've got the first of the robot books and the Stars Like Dust because I just read that. But beyond that, I couldn't tell you what ones I have, but I know I've got 4 or 5 others on my shelf right now that I need to look at and read at some point in time. So the ability to on the go while I'm looking at something, say, okay, do I have this or not, would be very, very valuable. Even if I only use it to do that spot checking. Next question. How do you decide to add a book to your personal library? By and large, for the most part, if it seems interesting to me, if it seems to fit with what my current mood is revolving around, and if it's priced well, I will consider getting it. I have good restraint in terms of I could easily walk into a bookstore and walk out with hundreds of dollars of books without even any effort, of ones that would catch my eye. So usually I try to limit myself to just a couple when I'm in there. And so then it becomes which ones are really calling out to me. And typically the first place I look is always going to be the medieval literature section and looking for works that I don't have. Then recently I would go from there to look at the poetry, and then to the science fiction and fantasy, and then to the ancient and medieval history area. And those are kind of my areas that I gravitate to in browsing for what I'm looking for. I've slowed down significantly on my medieval and ancient history because I find that I read them far less often than I want to pick them up, because there's so many that sound interesting, but when it comes to picking a book, they just don't get selected very often. It's far easier to say, well, I'm just going to sit down with this 200-page science fiction book and read through that versus picking up a book on, the Crusades, and even if it's the same number of pages, because I know one of them is going to be a faster read, most likely, than the other. Next question. When it's time to cull your personal library, how do you decide what stays and what goes? And I think I've kind of touched on this already. If it's something that I think I'm going to revisit in some way, shape, or form, I'm going to keep it. If it's something that becomes established, that I will definitely revisit, and probably revisit multiple times. A la Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, The Silmarillion. I then start to look at more of a premium kind of a copy to have on my shelf to turn back to, something that is going to be long lasting and something that is a joy to have on the shelf. But I wouldn't ever want to. I don't like having multiples of the same book. So even the idea of having a kind of a more beat up reader copy of one of those doesn't make much sense to me. Why would you have that book on your shelf if you're never going to read it, if it's just there for decoration? Next question. Does your personal library have books you haven't read? Yes. May not read. Yeah, there's some that I may not get around to because there's always going to be ones that are going to bump it down. I think by and large, every book that I've picked up is something that I'm interested in reading at some point in time. That some point in time might be a decade or two down the line. I don't know. But having them there, as long as they still call out to me, and some books do end up getting culled ahead of time. If I revisit it and I'm really looking through my collection and saying, okay, is this something that I'm likely to read at some point in time? Probably. There were on the science fiction and fantasy shelves some books that I've gotten as part of those uh, big bulk boxes off of eBay that are like book 7 in a series or book 3 in a series, where I don't have the earlier books. And those are probably going to get a harder look at them here soon to determine, is this even a series I have any interest in starting and picking up the earlier books on? If that answer is no, then I probably don't need to keep them in the off chance that I would ever want to read that, because my gut reaction when I pick it up and see book 3 of a series is probably going to be, well, I can't read this because I haven't read books 1 or 2 yet. It'd be like starting in the middle of jumping into the newest season of whatever TV show without watching what came before it. You might be able to pick up parts and pieces along the way, but you're going to feel like you're missing something because it's going to continuously refer to things that came before. And so you'll have a shallower experience with it than you would if you had read the previous books prior to getting to that. And so that's probably something I need to do at some point in time. Next question. What do you think about the idea of a zero TBR? And I've seen a lot of different answers to this. And by and large, the response is that's a baffling concept to have. It's comforting to know that there are books that I still haven't read that I can go and enjoy and explore. And I will echo that sentiment. It's nice to have those new adventures to go on, those new things to explore. You never know when you're going to find your next favorite author, favorite book series, whatever the case may be. I found this year Isaac Asimov is probably going to end up being among one of my favorite authors. Rediscovering Robin Hobb recently, discovering Robert E. Howard last year thanks to Michael K. Vaughan. and all of his talk of Conan, which led me to pick up those volumes of Conan the Barbarian and read one of them, and just fell in love with not just Conan the character, but Howard's writing, which is held up across several different of his characters. So I love the idea of having things to explore, but I'm also a very, very heavy-handed rereader. I'm almost always revisiting something along the way and love doing it because you catch more things every time, especially if it's been a significant length of time. So while I'm probably a candidate who would be okay with having a zero TBR, just because then, okay, well, I can now reread some of these books that I really enjoyed. I think there's still a balance I would strike between the two. And then, how do you feel about and towards your personal library? I don't think it's ever going to feel complete. That's complete is a very subjective thing to consider because at what point in time are you going to be able to step back and say, okay, this is a perfect collection? Some people probably would find a set of 20 books, their favorite 20 books or whatever, to be that perfect collection. The ones that they like to visit and revisit, maybe not as avid readers, not reading 10 books a month or anything crazy like that, but it's something that's always going to be growing, always going to be getting shaped. It's fun getting those new possibilities. And I will say in the last year, I've discovered it's also fun getting books that you wouldn't have expected, whether it's from the eBay boxes and seeing what is in there and what it contains, or getting surprise boxes from friends on BookTube and things like that, because there's no mail that's more delightful than book mail. And it's just a genuine joy. And I enjoy sending some of those along and trying to send along some extras when I do. I recently just sent off a package last week to Mindy from Mindy's Book Journey because she won the giveaway for the Cursed book. And two other books made their way into it because, I like spreading books and sharing them around. And I think that the other two that I threw in there are going to be ones that she'll enjoy. And, I hope to see that reaction of the surprise, the enjoyment of what is yet to come, and hopefully hear about how they go over for her at some point in time. And it's getting late here tonight. I'm getting rambly. And I know I'm getting rambly because this is a relatively short tag and it's been 23 minutes. So I'm going to just stop it here. Thank you, Shelley, for the great questions. In terms of people that I'm going to tag, I'm going to tag Jeremy Fee because I want to hear about him. I'm going to tag John from Hey Y'all Listen Up because I'd like to hear from him. And then we're going to tag some of the more youthful folks, an erudite adventure. I'd love to hear Tony and Kate's answers to these questions at some point in time. I know it'll be like 4 months, 5 months before they can get to it, and that's okay. There's no need to rush on getting to it. I'd love to hear your thoughts on your personal library because I remember when I was that age and how I viewed things versus how I do now, and I think it'd be really interesting to hear their answers to it. So thank you for watching and have a great rest of your day, book